Yeah. But part of that, and I keep stealing his line all the time, mercilessly. But Aaron said we live in a post-marriage society right now. We just don't know it yet. We're still trying to do marriage in the 20th century sort of sense. And
well, it's interesting because one of the things you commented on my video was about what I called the BPL analysis, which is in law school how you learn to analyze negligence and how you learn to define what's called an inherently negligent activity. So there are some activities that are so dangerous that it's what's called negligence per se, which means just engaging in it is negligent. And the way that you determine that is what's called the BPL analysis. And I said in the video that it's the burden, it's an equation, which is the burden of not doing a thing greater than the probability of harm and the severity of harm. Okay. So when I was in law school, I was already very interested in this subject. I wanted to be a divorce lawyer. And I wrote an analysis of it using essentially the BPL analysis, which is meant for like if your car is designed without a seatbelt, all right, what's the cost? What's the burden of putting in a seatbelt versus the probability of car accidents and the severity of harm caused by car accidents? And that's how seatbelts got in every single car, right? So what I tried to do is I tried to say, all right, what are you giving up if you don't get married? What's the burden of not getting married? So I actually did an analysis where I said, all right, think about it. What do you do when you get married? Well, you got someone to talk to. So, someone to talk to. And when you're first married, you got lots to talk about. But probably after 20, 30 years of marriage, all you want to talk about is like, what do you want to have for dinner? What do you want to watch on Netflix? So what would we have to pay someone to reproduce that? All right, sex. When you first get married, probably have lots of sex. It's high quality sex. But over the years, you might have less and less, and then eventually you have very limited amounts of sex. So let's see what it would cost to have a sex worker do that for us. And I basically tried to say, okay, versus what does it cost you to potentially get divorced? What is the harm that's caused by getting divorced? And essentially, I argued that because of the probability of divorce, marriage is an inherently negligent activity like owning a lion or having a trampoline next to a toxic waste dump. And the interesting thing is the BPL analysis was created by a Supreme Court justice named Learned Hand. That was his name, Learned Hand. And interestingly enough, he is one of the only Supreme Court justices who never married. So the name of the paper was, Would There Be a Ring on a Learned Hand? And I talked about the negligence of marriage. And I got to tell you, this is something that I think if we look at things rationally, pragmatically, like this is what you've urged in your work that I, from day one of reading your work, was always very drawn to, which is this is not against love. This is not against pair bonds. This is not misogyny. This is not misandry. This is not that there is no romance in the world, that sex and love and all those things don't mean anything. Those are some of the best things in the world. But the question is do we just let that irrationality and total lack of pragmatism, do we let that control, or do we let our rational minds? Because I don't think rational and romance are totally at ends with each other. I think that you can have a romantic relationship, a great sexual relationship, a great partnership with someone, and be pragmatic and be practical and still have that wonderful connection. So
well, if you probably read my fourth book, which was Religion. There's a big fat chapter in the middle of it called Marriage, based great chapter on that. And I started off by sort of recounting my interactions and my debates with Dr. Everett Piper on Pat Campbell's show back in the day. And of course, I take the anti-marriage side. And by the way, I have a great marriage. I just celebrated 27 years, and I'm probably one of the 2 or 3% that we're talking about here. Yeah. But you
won the lottery. You won the lottery.
But here's the other thing: is I understand female nature. I understand my own nature as a man. I understand the confluence of them together. So I'm better off as a husband because I'm red pill. And I think that really kind of blows people's minds, because they think that I can't be red pill because I'm married, or I can't be married because I'm red pill, vice versa. Right. But the thing that Dr. Piper and I talked about was the difference between a covenant marriage and a contractual marriage. A contractual marriage being in how we do it now, right? You have to go down to the courthouse, sign off on the papers and everything, and the state's involved and everything else goes along with that. Whereas like my friend Abu American Muslim has 3 or 4, I think maybe he's up to 4 wives now, but it's a covenant marriage, meaning like it's just before the eyes of God and his wife and his wives and his families and stuff like that. There's no contract, no government's not involved in that. And it was interesting to listen to this guy who is all, normatively a evangelical pastor who is very pro marriage, right? And he's arguing for the fact that we need the state involved because women need protections in it and all this other stuff. But I thought it was interesting because then there's those two. It's almost two different wants. It's the want for to be married, to have that pair bonding, to have that socially enforced monogamy. But then there's also the fact that we have to bring the state in, and then the state turns it into a contract. It's basically a little bit.
100%. And your point about covenant marriage. Look at one of your criticisms, if you want to call it that, of my interview. Was saying that, I talk about how marriage is rooted in things like land ownership. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, look, when you talk about covenant marriage, well, that is, of course, like that. Who knows what the history of that is? That's probably almost prehistoric. I mean, in terms of people saying we're going to have some spiritual significance or theological significance to our pair bond. I'm sure that and creation of a family and birth and offspring, I'm sure that there's been, before there was a state to grant a legal status of marriage on people, there was marriage as a concept. But that's the problem, is we're not talking about, and when you say, and I totally agree, there was a time in the United States, and I'm sure in other countries, where women's role, when women weren't allowed to own land, when women weren't allowed to have bank accounts, there was a time where women certainly did need those kinds of protections that marriage afforded. But just like always in this country, we solved dandruff with decapitation. We said, well, women are not protected, so let's create a system that is so unbelievably one-sided in terms of the promises men make in a marriage are legally enforceable after the marriage and after divorce. But the promises that the majority of women make in a marriage, which are, love and respect and affection and sex, none of them are legally enforceable. No one in the state can force that person to do. No one can force that. But all the things you promise, protection, financial security, care for the children, covering the cost of caring for the children, for the medical expenses of the children, all of those things are all enforceable by the full power of the state. Law. That is a contract of adhesion. That's what you call that in law school. It is a unconscionable contract, as you said. And it is what's an adhesion contract is a contract where the two people are not in equal bargaining positions. Right. And so when one end of the contract is enforceable and the other side is not, that's a contract of adhesion. That's not a fair contract. And that's what modern marriage is.
So adhesion or cohesion?
Adhesion.
Adhesion. I got to look at it. I like to because I became really familiar with all these legal terminologies when I was writing that chapter in religion. And then of course I was talking about, and I mentioned this in the last video, the coverture laws that existed back in, like, say, the 1700s, 1800s, or really up to the 19th to 20th centuries anyways. And the coverture laws were, women actually could own land. They could own money.
They inherited it.
They could inherit it. Yes. They could own their father's businesses and things like that. They actually did have a lot more rights than most modern feminists who don't do their homework would understand. But that was because of the coverture laws during that time, which meant that you could have all that, but once you got married to your husband was legally responsible for you and legally responsible for the children. So if your children became criminals, you had to be the one to be responsible for the kid. You were the one that was going to be punished as the father, right? Same thing for women. And so ergo, and I made this comparison here. Maybe you agree with this or don't, but back when the coverture laws were working kind of in men's favor, it was more, women had more power and could own land, had more control over their own lives and their own properties and stuff like that outside of marriage than inside of marriage. Whereas today men have more power outside of marriage than inside of marriage, because you were just saying the full power of the state. You can't out alpha the state. I'm sorry, but Black Pill Doomer, MGTOWs, you got a point. I'll give you a point. Okay. But, I made that sort of contrast between those two, the coverture laws of the 1800s versus where we are right now in the 21st century.
Yeah, and it's an excellent point, but I think fundamentally, look, I understand the desire to marry. I think that as I've said before, marriage is like the lottery. You're probably not going to win, but if you win, what you win is so good that I understand people's desire to buy a ticket and try. But I also think, and that's what I mostly talk about in that interview, is that I just think people have to be able to talk to each other about what their expectations are of each other, of the nature of that relationship. And if you can't have that practical, pragmatic discussion, I just think you have absolutely no business getting married. I mean, listen, I call it job security. Like, go ahead, get married as many times as you want to. Like, we're here and we'll do your divorce, and love is grand and divorce is $100 grand. But, you know, I don't understand why, when a simple couple of $1,000 prenup and a couple of uncomfortable conversations with a person that theoretically you like more than the other 7.3 billion people in the world, why I should be out of business. All I should be doing all day is writing prenuptial agreements and making a very modest income, because there is no lawyer who ever said, man, I got rich from writing prenups. Prenups are like a low profit business item for divorce lawyers. It is not something that litigation is where we make our money. And so many of these divorces end in litigation.
I don't think enough people really realize. I've used this before. This is the decline, and this just goes up to 2020. This is the decline in marriage rates in the United States from 1990 to 2020. So when you put it in black and white terms like that, then you can also look at, like, say, the fertility slump, which is right here, which, by the way, starts right around 1971, which is right after no fault divorce is instituted in California, and then all these other states are following suit. And then this is the one I actually wanted to show you right here, which is first marriages ended annually per 1,000 married couples, date and duration of the marriage. This is where I jump into, and by this is only like 2009 data.
Yeah, this is way old data.
There's more than this now from the more recent census data.
And again, marriage satisfaction is really what matters. And you're not going to, by the way, you're not necessarily going to get real clarity from people on marriage satisfaction either, because the question is compared to what? Compared to how they perceive other people's marriages to be, or compared to the line we've been fed for so many. I mean, look at every sitcom that was ever on TV. It's the wife rolling her eyes at the stupid husband, and the man being like, well, I guess you're not going to have sex with me unless it's my birthday. You know, like all that same, which is that what we're aspiring to? Like what that young people would say, oh yeah, in the prime of their lives, they go, you know what, sign me up for that unbelievable shit show. Like I'll take that on, and that makes sense for me. But I think, again, there's a presumption that people are going to marry. And I think ignorance is a huge piece of it, because as I've said before, and will continue to say as loudly as I can from the mountaintops, there is nothing else we do other than dying that is legally significant as marriage. It changes your inheritance rights, your property ownership rights, your rights when it comes to your retirement accounts, your rights when it comes to children produced of the relationship, your obligations. It changes everything, and no one explains it to you ever in advance. There is no other contract. Somebody said, oh, well, student loans, they don't explain to you student loans. Guys, student loans, it's easy to figure out. We're going to give you some money. You got to pay the money back, and there's an interest rate. That's not hard to understand. If you need someone to explain that to you, don't go to fucking college, because you're not smart enough to even go to college if you don't understand how math like that works. But marriage, someone explains to you that you've opted out of the title system. Like, someone should mention that to you before you sign on the line that's dotted. And no one does. And that, to me, how anyone could enforce a contract that no one ever explained to the two people who signed it before they signed it, and how that is the most enforceable and frequently. And we have an entire court set up to enforce that contract. The matrimonial part of any state supreme or superior court is designed to enforce a contract that no one read. And even if they read it, all it said is, I take this person to be my lawfully wedded spouse. No one knew what that meant. Next time you're around, talk to one of your friends who's married and say, by the way, you're married. Yeah, how long have you been married? Okay, tell me legally what happened when you got married. Legally, what happened to you? What rights did you get? What rights did you give up? Explain to me what that, I guarantee you, unless they're a divorce lawyer, they won't know, or unless they've been divorced. And why? Because that's when I teach those people that. But I teach them that when they're in my office.
They're learning to fight in the fight.
In the middle of the fight.
That was the best line. That was the best line in the whole thing too.